So you are unfortunately stuck with us for a few hours. So we can fill the time, we're good at that. Jeremy and I can talk all day if you want. We were both co-authors of the AASHTO Bike Guide update. We had a large team. We had a huge team behind us supporting us, and we've had a lot of help from public sector colleagues who sat on panels reviewing the guide and really critiquing our work throughout the process. And so we're still in the process, and we're in year 4, which is very hard to believe. Very hard to believe, but that's kind of the way design guidance of this significance can roll out. So I'm going to give a little more background on that. So I'm Bill Schultheiss. I'm just a PE. My colleague Jeremy is a man of many letters, many talents, and I think the most important letters up there are board member. I think really honored that he's serving on the APBP board. And this is such a fantastic organization. I'll say that I've been involved in this field for 16 years now. I came into it as I like to say I'm a reformed wastewater engineer. I hated my job, I hated engineering, I thought I'd made a huge sort of life mistake in investing my time and energy into becoming a wastewater engineer. Very bored with the work, unfulfilling. But I was a bike advocate, a bike racer at the time, not anymore. And I discovered that this was unknown to me as a career opportunity. I met Jennifer, and she took a chance and hired me, and I'm forever grateful for that decision. Just because I had transferable skills, I knew how to use AutoCAD. And I spent the rest of my career really trying to learn what transportation is all about, because I only took a couple classes in it at Northeastern. I didn't even know, I'm good friends now with Peter Firth, but I actually didn't even get to take a class with him when I was at Northeastern. We've gotten to know each other since then, and I say that the thing that's made walking and biking in particular a real fun endeavor is most of us didn't get training in this professionally. We had to learn on the job, and that comes from passion and caring about what we do. And I think what Keith brought forward today was that passion that we make a difference. I've gotten hugs from community members of projects I've done, and I never got that doing sewer pipes. So I think there's a lot of value in this work, and I think I'm really glad to see we're starting to embrace the equity as front and center. That's something that our firm is passionate about. There's a lot of injustice in our transportation system, and biking is one aspect that can address some of that, but there's obviously a lot more that needs to be done. So that's kind of a rambling background on myself. My colleague Jeremy, I'd like to say he's my wingman, but I would kind of lose my mind if he wasn't working with us, because he's really, since he's come to work for us, he's been my sanity. He's super smart. He had done a lot of highway design work. Came from Pennsylvania, a lot of really in-depth civil engineering, hardcore roadway design, and traffic engineering. I actually didn't get to do that, coming through as much, and so we're kind of tag team each other on our work. And so I think a lot of what you see is a great result of his mind and thinking along with all of our team partners back in the office. Again, on our panel, a couple are here. Elizabeth Hilton, I think, is an undiscovered, unknown in some parts, but a lot of the good that comes in the changes in design guidance flows through Ms. Hilton. And it's sort of an unexpected thing when you get into the writing of design guidance of how so few individuals can have a disproportionate impact on design guidance, and she's one of them. Has a lot of credibility and trust, working for Federal Highway and really knowing her stuff. And if it wasn't for Elizabeth, honestly, there's others, but she's a big part of changing hearts and minds at the DOT. And ultimately, an AASHTO guide is a DOT document. And and it involves getting permission from 2/3 of the 50 states plus the territories to say this is a good idea and we accept this change. And that's not an easy endeavor when the vast majority of their mission is highways and managing thousands and thousands of miles of roadway that they'll tell you they have insufficient funding to take care of, and that cities are really not their primary customer. And a lot of us are in the urban environment, and I think that it can be hard to kind of get that shared perspective, and a lot of what I'm seeing within AASHTO is a recognition that there needs to be some changes, and that the cities are very important to our economy, to our citizens and their safety, and that we need to tie them together, and that fixing our guidance is essential, is kind of front and center to that. So we've been thinking, really what we see with this new version of the bike guide is it's massive now, maybe bigger than we anticipated, but it's in many ways it's an urban street design guide, because it's really getting at what do we need to change to make sure our streets are safe for everybody. It kind of just has a bike focus, and that gets behind a lot of what we've done. So, big disclaimer, this is subject to change. I just mentioned we're in year 4 of this. And it's because there's a lot of players that need to say this is a good idea. So we finished the NCHRP part of this in May 2018. And we went through multiple rounds. There were a lot of rounds of revision. I believe we were 3 drafts to get to the final in May of 2018 by our NCHRP panel members. And then we are now working with the Active Transportation Committee. And we have gone through 2 rounds of comment response with them and changes. I'm waiting for last little comments from them to come in the next week or 2. And then we're going to make some final revisions. I've been told they're relatively minor. And then we kick it off to the real crew, the geometric design, which is really the highway designers, and the traffic engineers, which are really the state DOT traffic engineers. And as you can imagine, their perspective tends to be at a different scale than what we're operating in. So they're going to get opportunities to review and comment, filtering their comments through the Active Transportation Committee. And then we need to address their comments. And they're going to be our harshest critics in this process. And we need to build their support because ultimately they are the voting members that decide whether this guide gets adopted. And so I can't promise how long this will take. Our hope is that we can kind of do this in an expeditious manner over the next 6 months to 12 months, and then hopefully by next summer we can have a guide that's ready to go to AASHTO, the organization, which is really just a nonprofit like NAPTO, where then they will publish the guide and format it. So this is very tentative, and it's honestly these dates every time we present on this have been moving further out because there's just so many people involved in this. And part of the challenge is that this guide's gotten a lot bigger. Every chapter in red here is a new chapter that did not exist. And I'm going to give you a little history lesson here for the next 10 minutes or so, which will shed some light on why this guide is so different. So, I was always passionate about history, and I read a lot of history books, and I kind of try to learn as much as I can about how we ended up in the place we are in. How did this happen? And within the framework of bicycling, it's an interesting history itself. And I was doing so much of that when we got into the update of the guide. I knew there were points of controversy because I got to work on the last guide in 2012, which we wrote in 2009. So you think back to 2008 and 2009 and the types of things we were doing in this country for cutting-edge bikeway design. Separated bike lanes were not on the agenda. We actually had a chapter on it. We had a whole chapter on emerging treatments at protected bike lanes and bike boxes and 2-stage turnkey boxes and bike signals, and it was deleted because there was fear that we weren't ready and there wasn't enough built, and it was just too speculative on whether these were good ideas. And as you can imagine, since 2009, when that decision was made, we've built a lot of that stuff. So looking back at the history, it's interesting is in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a big movement to address air quality. EPA was invented. There were bike protests. They're interesting to read about. First Earth Day was an interesting one. People literally rode gas masks on their bikes because the air quality was so bad. There was a push to do a lot more improvements for bicycling, and some of them were interesting because they were pushes for making the street safer for cycling. And I love this one because how many people have heard, the discussion if you're online or whatever, you kind of keep up with what other cities are doing. Well, the city of San Francisco has been trying to improve Market Street since 1972 for cyclists. They're still talking about it. They're still making changes, and there's a lot of controversy. What do you do to change it? But this has been an ongoing discussion now for 50 years, which is, I think, stunning. But they've never given up, and they're working on it. In the early 70s, there was a bike boom. Carlton Reed wrote a book on it. It's fascinating, called Bicycle Boom. But if you can look at old plans that were written in the early 70s, very ambitious. There were a lot of hopes and dreams in the cities around the U.S. that they'd become bicycle-friendly communities. And there was even some research funded by the federal government. USDOT funded the initial 70s research. And a lot of it, the work was actually in Davis, California, because they were the first city in America to build bike lanes, and I was really impressed with the level of quality of the engineering minds in the early 70s on this. Really detailed thinking, really good analysis, and they found a lot of things that we know are challenges and we don't know to be true. Bike lanes generally safer, contraflow cycling is higher risk. Cyclists aren't really moving all that fast, and then motorists, of course, will do what they do and park in bike lanes if you give them a chance. So this is no mystery. We've known this for 50 years. But these things became controversial statements, interestingly enough, as I'll talk about. So that quality research led to the first AASHTO Bike Guide in 1974. And as I talked to people around then, they didn't even know this existed. I talked to a gentleman who worked for Federal Highway in 1981. He didn't know about this guide, didn't remember it. And I found that interesting, and why did this guide disappear? But this guide had separated bike lanes in it, protected intersections, in large part because of the findings from the early California research. It recommended that bike lanes never be terminated at intersections. They continue all the way through. That should actually mark them through the intersections, like there's a bicycle crossing, like a bike crosswalk. And they even do two-stage turn boxes. All three of those things became amazingly controversial in the 80s and 90s, even in through the 2000s, and even to the present day, they're still not done in most communities. So there were even warrants. There's a lot of our profession loves warrants. Engineers love, help me make decisions. And so they had very low volume thresholds of when a bike lane would be warranted. 2,000 vehicles a day was considered a busy street. Should have a bike lane. That's definitely every arterial roadway in America. There were some amazing instructional videos, and I'm going to show you a few pictures. You can find this on YouTube, and it is worth watching because you see actual video of the real conditions, the built environment. Bicycling safely on the roads from the 1974, I believe. You can Google that, YouTube. So these pictures are screenshots I stole on the bottom from that video. And they're videotapes of Davis in the early 70s. The initial AASHTO guide recommended that we think about bike trails and bike lanes as actually having lanes, like we do for cars. Like, what's one lane? One lane's at least 3.5 feet wide, desirably 4. Well, do I want a 4-lane facility? It should be, progressively wider. And that concept of lanes is really important when you think about our shared use path system. And we know that there's challenges that result from not having lanes. But the challenge in the 1970s is understanding the context of the 70s. We didn't have ADA. There were very few curb ramps. So when you start saying it's okay for bikes to ride on paths, and the path's a designated sidewalk, because cycling on sidewalks is largely illegal, Then you had to put up bike route signs to make it legal to ride on the sidewalk, because that's where people felt safer. It started creating this idea of sidewalk routes and paths, and that bicyclists were losing their rights to the road. And can you imagine, again, screenshots from that video, well, how fun is it to ride on a sidewalk with no curb ramp? You get to be a pretty good, skilled cyclist jumping curbs, but you don't want to be told you have to ride there. You don't want any perception that you have to ride there. Well, that caused controversy. There was an amazing conference I was able to dig up and actually get the proceedings from it. And back then, no internet. You had to get the printed document where everyone had to submit everything I said today. I had to write down and put into the documents so people would know what was talked about. But the thing that struck me as really prescient in 1973 was this fundamental question. What are we doing? What's the target design user? What's the target design trip? Are we trying to move cyclists as a small amount of cyclists as fast as they can possibly go, which is really kind of the racing's end of the spectrum? Are we trying to maximize the use of cycling for the reasonable short trips that people take? And try to create a system that is appealing to the most number of people? This was a question that was being argued in the early 1970s as a fundamental question for the profession. And it was answered loudly that, in fact, we wouldn't try to create a system for the mass of people and what they wanted. We would create a system for a small number of people who were the real cyclists. Once we're already out there and who were comfortable, not afraid of traffic. And you look at the advertisements from the 70s, and if you're serious about cycling, your bike shouldn't be a toy. And there's this whole concept that cycling on the sidewalks or protected bike lanes, where you're not a serious cyclist. That's really child's play. That real cyclists ride the road, and real cyclists put on the lycra costume, and real cyclists get racing bikes sold by Raleigh. And actually, you look at what the bike manufacturers made back then, and it was mostly racing bikes. And so we created a whole culture around that. And unfortunately, John Forrester became powerful in this perspective because he really understood the levers of power, how things worked. So he joined the California Cycling Association, became its president, was joining the League of American Cyclists, got on the board, and then he got involved with influencing design guidance in the state of California. And he did this experiment, he said, this kind of as an experiment. He rode his bike on the sidewalk as fast as he normally would on the road, and of course that's dangerous, and then reported it that it was dangerous. This was his research project, was his own personal anecdote. Printed it in a book, and then went around and told engineers how dangerous that was, that any bikeway off the road was dangerous, and would create liability problems for agencies, and he scared them. So he invented his effective cycling program, and actually that video you watch is hit. That video I encourage you to look up is 25 minutes of his philosophy of how this would be a better way to approach cycling, and that this was really the vision. It's just we need to overcome the human tendency of fear and anxiety, put those motions aside, and just toughen up and get out of the street. The only thing stopping you from cycling was your own mind. We know that today that's not true. The problem we had in the 70s is without widespread access to information is whoever wrote things down had power. He published books, went to conferences, he lobbied agencies. I've literally seen this book on the shelf of state DOT's engineering libraries. It had an impact. And you can see it here. A serious cycling facility should be designed for 30 miles an hour. Well, that's a very small percent of the population that wants to go that fast and is willing to do it. And then if you're trying to do something less, you're not really trying to get that serious cyclist. And this one just strikes me, that a facility is designed only for childlike and incompetent cyclists is very insulting to people. Encourages the toy bicycle attitude and discourages cycling for transportation. These are not made up quotes. This is really the mindset that pervaded this. And then you look at the contrast in this photo from the Netherlands and you think about, why did people listen to this man? Why was this not seen for the ridiculousness that it was? And the reality is, he was really smart again about levers of power. There was a proposal, and Bicycling Magazine was interesting to read in the 70s. It was always this give and take. If someone wrote an opinion piece, and John Forster was good at this, if someone wrote a research study, he demanded a rebuttal. There's so many research reports from the 70s where he was given permission to write a rebuttal to that research statement. That is unheard of, really, I think, in a lot of what we see. And his rebuttals were not based on science or evidence. They were based on his opinion. So he was given an enormously outsized ability to influence design guidance in this country. There's this gentleman, Bob Somner, who was a really big advocate in Davis, a professor at Davis, actually. He said, hey, let's stop this war. We're all trying to create a system where people are willing and happy to promote cycling. You're trying to promote cycling. We're trying to promote cycling with separated infrastructure, bike lanes. Why are we fighting with each other? He said, why don't we join up and we'll create networks. We'll advocate for networks of bike lanes and paths for people that don't want to be in traffic. And we'll also advocate for you to maintain your right to the road. So we don't create mandatory use laws. We'll oppose them. Let's join up together. And it was flatly rejected as a slippery slope, that if we give in an inch, we're going to lose it all. And so he took with his colleagues, and this guy was important, John Finley Scott, because he became the head of CABO after John stepped down. And then John was on the primary committee writing updates to the first Caltrans bikeway design guide, and kept the influence and pressure going. And he said, absolutely not. The only place they'd support bike infrastructure was on a trail through a park in a field somewhere. They opposed every bike infrastructure out there, the slippery slope to them losing their rights to the road. So there's this interesting back and forth where you can actually read them through Bicycling Magazine and see this back and forth. These are my daughters. So I think, the idea of what's risk, irrational fear, I was really, use my children as props. I was freaked out. I was really nervous. My kids are confident. They're 8 and 10 at this time. We're biking to the summer camp. The U.S. Capitol is just 6 blocks away. And this bus blows by us. When you're looking at this has now become our standard, largely because it was so complicated in the 70s. We couldn't get bike lanes in the 70s. The bike lane became the best thing we could do for a long time because of this advocacy in the 70s. So this is great to have, but there's no room for error. We talk about sustainable safety is creating a system where you can make a mistake and not pay for it. There's zero room for error. Someone opens their door, my daughter, she's trying to talk to her sister. They're trying to have a conversation as I ride. It's impossible. My daughter starts turning her head while her bike starts to swerve in the direction she's turning her head. It's super unsafe, and they are oblivious. They don't know how dangerous this is. They're living in their world. They're having a great time. And they also know it's instructive when I talk to them a lot about this. I'm like, let's ride on the sidewalk. No, they don't want to ride on the sidewalk. Why? Why don't they want to ride on the sidewalk? Anyone have a thought? What did they tell me?
Full of people.
What?
Full of people.
Full of people, pedestrians, dogs. It's bumpy. They want to be what? They want to be big people. Big people ride the street. So they're always after me to get in the road. And we try to do what we can, but there's no margin for error here. And I think what's challenging is that in the 1970s, white male-dominated advocacy in this space didn't care. It was about their perspective. I'm comfortable with it. I don't care about your perspective. And I'm going to drive this. And it's unfortunate because this 74 AASHTO paper was really tragic. Harold Munn was working for Caltrans, helping write design guidance. And he said basically, culturally it was going to be impossible to create a system where we had biking as normal in the United States. That ship had sailed. We're a car culture. We're always going to be a car culture. And People just need to get used to riding the road. And why do I say these things matter, this advocacy? The first bike guide ever written is 1978 Caltrans Bike Guide. Look at 2 sources in it. These are sourced in the bibliography. Harold Munn's pessimistic article saying, this is never going to happen, get used to riding the road, and John Forrester's nonsense that was not based on science, but was called a design guide, were sourced in the first 1978 Caltrans Bike Guide as valid sources to make decisions about design guidance. And what that led to was, again, a strong push of advocacy that all the things that we now know are important for safety were removed from the next version of the guide. In 1981, protected bike lanes were removed, protected intersections were removed, 2-stage turn boxes were removed. It was actually stated as a better practice to terminate bike lanes before intersections. You should mark bike lanes through intersections because, bicyclists didn't have the lane positioning. They were removed not based on science, but based on advocacy, strenuous advocacy. And I talked to Mr. Lemieux, and he was the guy that worked for Federal Highway, who was one of the prime authors of the 81 guide, and who did not remember the 1974 guide, didn't know about it. And he said John Forrester provided over half the comments in the 81 guide. And I've talked about how long we've been working on this update to the current guide. He dominated the space back then. And so it's interesting that in the next 81 AASHTO Bike Guide, this is a quote from the introduction. Really, the only way we're going to improve cycling in motorists is through behavior, enforcement, and education campaigns. That's the way we're going to make a safer outcome. And we know that education and enforcement are not enough, that they really have a very minimal impact on changing built environment outcomes. And then it led into changes of federal policy, really de-emphasizing it, kind of stopped funding it, stopped funding research. And then the idea was, well, the wide outside lane become the thing. This was the magic treatment that was going to make it great for everybody. And it's still in state DOT design standards to this present day. The state of Texas wrestles with this. And they have a design directive that every road they build has to have a 16-foot wide outside lane to accommodate cyclists. And it doesn't matter if that road is 55 miles an hour or 25 miles an hour. That is the default standard for cyclists. And it led to this problem culturally, the 1% problem, I call it. I go to any public meeting and the average person says, why are we doing this for such a small minority of the population? And when they say that, they're talking about cyclists, racing groups, typically, the Spandex Road Warrior. Why are we making these changes for them, for this small niche group? And so what I like to say is that we need to understand this history because it created a culture that we're living with the ramifications to the present day that affect not only the design profession, but public's perception of what cycling is, because we built out this environment. So all that said is, how do we end up with where we are now? So the 1981 guide, the 91 guide, the 99 guide, they just kept copying the other guide. Very small changes were made. So that philosophy of vehicular cycling was baked into the guide in 1981, and it remained all the way through, honestly, the 2012 guide that I worked on with Michael Toole and some others. And it was hard to change it. So what's different in this guide is understanding that that was the basis of all those guides. We had to say that it wasn't based on science, and we're throwing it all out, and it led to a complete rewrite of the whole guide, totally. And now the guide's 400 pages. A lot of new graphics. It's really in depth, but it had to overcome this legacy, and that was not easy. And that legacy still persists to this day in the minds of some of the people we need to get to approve this new document, because they're not aware of this history or why. They just know that we've changed a prior guide, and they assume it was all based on science, and it wasn't. And so we went through extraordinary lengths in this guide to source everything. I'm really proud of the fact that this is this AASHTO document has more sources than any other document I've seen in an AASHTO publication. It's hundreds. We've sourced everything because I got super frustrated going through prior guides with no sources or sourcing opinion pieces and saying, well, what is my basis for justifying these changes? And I don't want any future author of these guides to wrestle with what we had to go through. Now they know why we wrote things that we wrote. And if for some reason research proves that some of these things were wrong, then we know what was wrong and we can change it. But we're not going to have an opinion-based document for design guide anymore. It's going to be based on science and facts. And that's the way it always should have been. So we have an introduction, very traditional. So what I'm going to spend the rest of today, I took much longer than I think you probably anticipated. I think that we could pause for a minute. There's some questions maybe on this. But what we want to do for you is, I feel like that history is important for the profession to know. I think we need to talk about it because I think if we want to continue to get change, we need to understand kind of how we ended up here. What we plan to do in the rest of our time is give you some insights into what we put into the guide. Again, like we say, it's draft, it's subject to change. We cannot give you a copy of this presentation. It's being videoed, so you can watch John's video, Perils for Pedestrians, and see it. You take pictures of the slides, and tweet them, but don't say AASHTO is doing X, Y, Z, because we don't know that that's the case. I think a lot of this is likely to get adopted. I'm hearing quite positive reviews on it, but again, everything is subject to change. The biggest thing that we've wrestled with as a profession is we design to the minimums. The presumption has been that if you do to the minimum, it's safe. What does safe mean? We've been challenging that notion of what safe means in this guide head on. When it comes to safety of a vulnerable user who's not in a metal box, that safety has to include comfort in your perception of whether you're safe, if it's going to be real. And so we're being very explicit in saying use of minimum value should not be considered a default, and we're saying that explicitly in the guide because this frankly has been an industry problem. And we're saying that you really want to focus on the preferable end of the spectrum. You need to justify why you're not doing that, if you're going to deviate from it. And then we really talk about, what's going to happen in certain conditions. We explain that if you're using constrained conditions, is it truly constrained? If you use minimum dimensions, that it's clear it should be as an internal strategy for a limited distance and really where bike lines are lower. Or you have a unique circumstance like a very short, an example is like a protected bike lane next to accessible parking. You could pitch it down briefly to get by that location, as you see in this photo from Denver, where it's not necessarily unsafe and we have a higher need to accommodate people with disabilities at this location. But we're not designing a 4-foot wide protected bike lane for 2 miles, because that would be unsafe and uncomfortable. And so we're helping visualize for the reader of this document what these things mean. We've had a problem in prior editions of the guide, and actually at the METCD, kind of how we talk about this. What do these things mean? We've had a meaningless term, bicycle facilities, that's tossed out there for a long time. And when you look at the definition of it, it includes, everything from bike lanes to parking garages. Well, that's true. They're all facilities. That's great. But it's really too broad of a term, and it creates confusion. So we've created a new term, bikeway, which that term's been used, I think, informally. What does it mean? We tried to define it. We're open to suggestions for improvement if you think there's some. But the challenge with what we wanted to really emphasize is that bikeway is not a share road. One, that a bikeway physically separates you from traffic, or it's an intentional design to force traffic calming, which is what a bicycle boulevard does. Really prioritizes your movement. So you're either creating designated space with a separate lane, or you're traffic calming a local street that's really saying it's bike priority. That's the intent here, because people are calling share roads bikeways, and it's a different ballgame, and we're trying to make that distinction. And separated bike lane is the other one. This is an emotional one. A lot of the industry likes to call them protected bike lanes, and I'll tell you straight up, it's never going to happen in an AASHTO document because the word protected is scary. And so kind of going more with the obvious and separated, I think it's sort of it's perceived to be a non-biased term about what it is, just describes what it is. But it needs to be physically separated by vertical elements, and I think what's interesting is if you use a horizontal buffer, and we've added that in the recent iterations of this, because ideally a separated bike lane has a buffer. But the reality of what we're seeing on the ground, where some agencies in truly constrained conditions have no buffer. And you can see that in the photo on your right. It's in DC actually. By our baseball stadium, where DDOT went out and put flex posts on the bike lane line because the choice for them was very practical. A bike lane that motorists park in 24 hours a day, or a 6-foot wide bike lane with flex posts on the lane line to keep the cars out and actually have a bike lane. That was the reality of their situation. And so we fought about this at the National Committee of whether that's okay to call that a protected bike lane. But I think we have to think about it from the standpoint of who the customers are. We actually had people arguing in our National Committee that, well, a protected bike lane, separated bike lane needs to have a horizontal buffer to be a separated bike lane, that if it doesn't have a horizontal buffer, then it's just a bike lane. I said, well, that's silly because if I add that flex post, Joe average citizen sees a flex post and says this is a protected facility. And they don't care about the nuance of our engineering profession. So we call things what they are and how they resonate with the public. Something that I think deserves a group that deserves a lot of kudos, and I talked about Elizabeth. We have Brooke Struve here as well, sitting next to Elizabeth. Brooke does a lot of training around the U.S. to change hearts and minds, and Federal Highway has really led. Darren Buck took, raise your hand, Darren, we got the Federal Highway trifecta here today. Federal Highway's been leading on this for the last 6 years and providing a lot of excellent guidance that now are primary sources for us in this update to the AASHTO guide. And I'll say that's powerful because we're sourcing Federal Highway as partial justification for what we're doing. And Federal Highway's leading to try to achieve their goals to be more sustainable and multimodal. And they provide a lot of inspiration, in many ways permission for some of the more car-oriented DOTs to be more multimodal. It's really important. And that's led to changes in the Green Book. The Green Book is really going to be supportive of the new bike guide, and we're referencing each other. But the Green Book is now going to be more context sensitive. And it's really, I think, important. This version is super important. And in the next version, there's a lot of discussion. Maybe the next Green Book needs to be, there's an interesting conversation going on. Should we have 2 Green Books? One for cities and one for highways? Or should we do away with the bike guide? And should we have one master street design book and combine it all so we can understand the trade-off choices we're making? So that conversation's happening within AASHTO, and I think that's wonderful. They've always supported flexibility. We continue to do that. But I think, like I mentioned, the most powerful aspect of the new Green Book is context sensitiveness. And I think when we're in the urban environments where we're talking about, that's crucial. And we do a lot of the history of safety research. A lot of it wasn't based on an urban context, really rural, suburban, highway context. And that research was misapplied in urban areas to devastating consequences for safety, ironically, in urban communities. This book was really important, I think, for really showing ways in which we're misinterpreting existing design guidance. So this, again, was a primary source for our guide, as is the METCD. Now, the challenge in the METCD is, like AASHTO, it's on a slower update timeline. And we're, at this point, we didn't want to be, we were in a situation where the METCD that was published in 2009 was last written really in like 2007. And so now we're dealing with an amazingly outdated document when it comes to bicycling. So we made a deliberate choice in the AASHTO guide to work with the METCD, but we have to kind of move on. We can't wait for you. And so we've included a whole bunch of treatments that are not in the current METCD, but are likely to be in the next edition, because they've all been approved actually by the National Committee, and I think are likely to end up in the new METCD. Excuse me.
Well, 8 slides are good.
I'm going to let, the thing that's great is we're still wrestling with this, is how to describe what's an experimental treatment, what level of detail to go into. But they're in there. But the reality is the METCD might be issued at the end of the year. And if it is, then a lot of things that we're calling experimental may no longer be experimental. So again, we're going to have to keep updating the guide to keep up. I'm gonna let Jeremy, we're gonna start to flip back and forth.
Yeah, and the thing about the guide to keep in mind is it's a guide, it's not a standard. I feel like engineers get really hung up on that term, and the way I think of it is a standard is something that a structural engineer needs to use. If you don't design to the standard, the building falls down. Guidelines are just a guide, and that means that there's that inherent flexibility built into it, and we should really be leveraging that on all of our projects, applying the engineering judgment and the planning judgment that we're allowed to use to get the best benefit for each individual situation. And everything that we're doing really needs to be context sensitive. And I don't know whether Bill mentioned it, feel free to ask questions as the slides are up here. We do not have a question slide except at the very end, and I'd rather have you ask the question when the content is up on the screen rather than having to flip back through 150 slides. So we'd like this to be as interactive as possible and for you to get as much useful information for you to take home, because like we said, we don't know when this will actually be published. Chapter 2 deals a lot with operations and safety and really the basics of these concepts. And as Bill mentioned, it is very dense in terms of research and studies that have been prepared. So if you follow the guidance that's in this guide and the homework that Jennifer Dill gave us this morning, we will already tell you what sources you can turn to dive a little bit deeper into this content. But that everything we've done here has been very heavily researched, very heavily influenced by the research that has already been prepared. And a lot of this goes way back. So as Bill mentioned, studies all the way back to the 70s really hit on these ideas that riding against traffic is more dangerous. That you have lower crash rates when you actually provide facilities. But we also still have all the anecdotal evidence that we know that when you're riding on a shared use path, things like a bollard in the middle of the path, while maybe good intention to keep vehicles out, present safety challenges. That when you have insufficient width, and we've all experienced this on our most congested shared use paths on the weekend, it's a nice day, everybody wants to be out on it, but we designed it to the minimum of 10 feet, that's not going to be comfortable or safe for anybody. And really leveraging those experiences and that research to provide the types of facilities that we want. And this is just another spattering of some of the other research. The one I want to focus on here is this idea of the standard bike lane versus the shared bike lane. While I follow the APBP community, I'm also an ITE member, and you get this on their community a lot, on their online interface, where people say, well, a bike lane in the door zone is unsafe, so we shouldn't do it. Well, that's just garbage. The research shows us that when you provide a bike lane, it's going to be more safe than the shared lane environment. And we can point to multiple studies, but also multiple locations around the country where this has been the case. So one example is 15th Street in Washington, D.C. It used to be a shared lane environment, and you had maybe 30 bikes a day that would ride on it. And yet they had 20 crashes per million cyclists in that scenario. Then they did a one-way separated bike lane, but then you couldn't get home because it was a one-directional facility and nothing to link you back up. You saw a little bit of increase in ridership. The safety also improved. And then when they provided a two-way facility, which we know two-way facilities have inherent problems with operations at intersections, there are some safety challenges to it. But what we saw is that the crashes per capita went down. 7 crashes per million cyclists in that location. And you're also seeing that the ridership is going up. And then we have other research that points to the idea of when you have a connected network and you have higher ridership, that in and of itself creates safety in numbers principle. So everything in this guide just turns back to the research to be able to point the people that are trying to implement this to the more information that they may need to justify their design. And even with these numbers, you still have headlines like this, that the 15th Street bike lane is the most dangerous bike lane in DC, which is just not factual. It's not looking at all the statistics of that location. So we have high ridership, so we might have more crashes than what used to be there before. You only had 30 bicyclists there before. Now you have hundreds a day that are riding on it. So you might have more crashes, but what we find is the severity of those crashes are much, much lower. And as I said, the number per user is also much lower. So the headlines just are not factual. Being able to dive into the data of each of these locations is really important to justify the designs. And our hope is that by providing you all these sources in the AASHTO guide, that you'll have the information to be able to push back when people try and counter your design decisions. It's also important to recognize that the design user for the AASHTO Bike Guide, as mandated in our initial NCHRP study, was that we're designing for the interested but concerned bicyclist. And this is just a fundamental difference of what we had been doing in the past with the AASHTO Bike Guide. And the reason being is, when we design for the interested but concerned bicyclist, we're designing for the vast majority of people that would choose to bike. And we're still accommodating the highly confident and the somewhat confident bicyclist with these designs. So there's nothing in this guide that precludes designing for a higher speed bicyclist with specific facility types, but putting more of a lens on the needs of that interested but concerned bicyclist so that we can see an actual change in mode shift. But we also have to recognize that a lot of these interested but concerned bicyclists have very different performance characteristics. They typically are biking a little bit slower than our strong, fearless cyclists. And they might also have different characteristics in terms of the bikes that they're riding. You start to see lots more cargo bikes, bikes with trailers, pulling your kid, trying to get to daycare, you want to be able to go to the grocery store after work. And so the bikes themselves are also changing. And that's all baked into this guide as well. For chapter 3, this gets into planning. So all the baseline efforts that we need to build out our bicycle networks. And it focuses on these 4 key principles: safety, comfort, connectivity, and this concept of legibility. That it should be intuitive to somebody trying to use the network how to navigate through it. They shouldn't have to look at a sign over here and then look at that signal over there. It should just be intuitive. And also recognizing that we need to do a better job in community planning to create links where they don't exist. This idea that with cul-de-sacs, we've sort of broken up our street network and forced bicyclists that might live here to go all the way out to the street, even though they're just trying to get to the school. And this is something that in the transportation side, we don't always have control of. That's why we need to involve politicians, involve the decision makers that approve the planning effort of communities to be focusing on these issues. We can include this as part of our bicycle master plans and find these opportunities to retrofit existing neighborhoods. But as new neighborhoods are built, these need to be fundamental ideas baked into the design of those communities. And that's very true in a suburban context, where oftentimes these are developed, built, and then we think about the transportation network after the fact. This needs to be part of that upfront planning. This idea of legibility and connectivity, that when you have one bike lane, and I see this all the time, you build a bike lane, nobody uses it because it doesn't connect to anything, and then you hear from the public, well, nobody uses that, why are we doing more? And it's because it doesn't get you anywhere. We need to have a network that actually gets people from their homes to the destinations that they're trying to get to. And that's not just getting them to work, it's creating links to the store, to the doctor, those short trips that are all around your house. And it's really easy to focus on this idea of, well, the commute mode share, that's what we need to focus on. No, it's all those little things around your house that you should be able to link to. One of the things I ask when I'm doing trainings and workshops is, when you were a kid, would your parent let you go and buy a lollipop? Just walk to the corner store to buy a lollipop. And for me, yeah, my parents let me do that all the time. Everything was a little bit slower, the road network was more comfortable, and it was not uncommon to let kids sort of roam free like that. And then, would you let your child today walk to the store to buy a candy bar? Well, you're not allowed candy anymore, but if you did let them have candy, would you let them walk to the store? And I think there's been a fundamental shift in the way that we've designed roads that has created this environment where we don't let our kids sort of go out and explore the neighborhood anymore because it's simply not safe. Being able to ride your bike to and from the store should just be common knowledge, and that's what we need to design for in terms of connectivity. But recognizing that not all roads are going to be part of a low-stress network. We're going to have a core network that will accommodate people of all ages and abilities, but there are going to be some streets that are still more geared towards a high-stress tolerant person. And that's okay as well, as long as we're making the connections to the places that we're trying to get people. And this becomes a bit of a balancing act, knowing that you're not going to have a low-stress facility on every street, making sure that the density of that network is sufficient to get the mode share that you want. And as we look at examples around the country, the places that have sort of focused on the basic network and high-stress tolerant networks really don't have a high bicycle mode share because it fundamentally doesn't accommodate those people. Interweaving these types of networks together is really going to get us a network that's going to work for the most amount of people, and that's that 72%. It's really accommodating everybody that chooses to bike. So recognizing this as you're doing the effort of planning out your network, establishing what is going to be that low-stress network, and then overlaying that with the other types of networks, and making sure that people can get from A to B in a way that's going to accommodate their abilities. And I sort of mentioned this before, this idea that we focus so much on the commute, but the number of trips that are commutes is really only around 30% of the trips that we take every day. All the other things are shopping, going to the grocery store, going to the movies, or whatever else we're doing. It's a much larger percent of the types of trips that people are taking. And we need to focus on that to create links between somebody's house and the trailhead. I ask people, what type of cyclist are you? And I'll often hear, I ride on the weekends, I ride with my family on the trail. And when you ask those people, how do they get there? Well, I load my bike onto the car and we drive to the trailhead, and then we bike on the trail and it's nice, and then we load it back on and we drive home. We need to be making those connections between people's houses and the trail, and also recognizing that the trails themselves will serve an important purpose for some slightly longer trips. Again, this idea of overlaying these different types of networks and understanding what their use is to get the biggest bang for our buck.
Sure. All right. So I think what we're trying to really help the designers understand when they read this is how the philosophy of the design user is really crucial in the goal, and that your agency goals may be different. And this is a point of contention and confusion, I think, in fear within some of the DOTs that are responsible for the road system is they have an existing environment. We made a lot of choices. It is a certain way. And there's always a nervousness that they're going to write something that says it's not good enough. So all their roads are deficient. And now there's a mandate to fix them. There's going to be a liability problem because we're saying they're not safe. And that's not what we're saying in this guide. But we're saying, and we're trying to be more direct in a way that has not been before, and saying if you really want to encourage and promote cycling, your streets need to look different than they do now. And if you're not willing to do that, that's fine. You have permission to not make that choice. But don't expect a lot of cycling. Don't expect things to change. And so we're trying to be more direct and say that if you really want to improve cycling safety and actually increase use, there's a land use component to this. But you as the transportation agency have to make some different design choices. And we're going to tell you how to do that. So we've got a chapter on bikeway selection, which actually largely is following the new federal highway resource, the bikeway selection guide. And it starts with the concept of design controls, but again, who's a design user? And you know, some agencies are going to say, we don't care about the interest of a concerned design user. They're not our target audience. We're going to focus on the cycling club racer, and that's totally fine if that's what that community wants. But I think a lot of other communities are going to have different goals. What kind of bike, what kind of vehicle, a design vehicle? You know, engineers are so focused on design vehicles. You know, is it a truck or a WB50 or whatever? But increasingly, with the electrification, bicycles coming, we're seeing quite a diversity of vehicles, and also we're wrestling with it still, and I think we're going to keep wrestling with it until it's printed. You know, what do we call new mobility? You know, should this be called a bike guide anymore, or is it something else? Because now we got scooters and we've got other electric mobility devices, and they're going to be using this. And we need to be a little more inclusive in who our design user is, thinking about those users. And so we're writing the guide to reflect that these things are coming, but it's going to keep being called a bikeway guide for now. But I think as a profession, we have to wrestle with this question a little bit. So focusing on context, so taking advantage of the fact the new Green Book is defining these contexts very specifically, helping that, you know, and that the goal of the AASHTO guide is to actually accommodate the vast majority of the population. Really, the target design user assumption should be the interest of a concern. And we're really basing that analysis on the level of traffic stress, which Peter Firth helped develop at Northeastern. So we've got the charts the engineers love, giving just the speed and volume, and help me pick my dot, because I know those two things. And we also know through research that the speed and volume of traffic are really the most fundamental aspects of whether a person feels safe or not on a roadway. So you see that the volume thresholds are quite low. When you think back to the 1974 bike guide, the low volume threshold was 2,000 vehicles per day. 25 miles an hour speed limit should have a bike lane. So we're triggering that roughly, kind of make the jump from shared lane to bike lane at about 2,000 to 3,000 cars a day. And when you think about bike boulevard design guidance, they tend to recommend it should be less than 2,000 vehicles a day. Portland is maybe a leader in bike boulevard design guidance. I know you've been talking about even lower thresholds than that on some of your streets. But again, we're starting to have research that is backing up these decisions. We also have a huge system of rural roads, and the reality of rural roads is that a lot of it's going to be, we'll be lucky to have shoulders on them. We have a lot of efficient rural roads, and there's not even a shoulder. And that may be, the design assumption here is maybe a more confident cyclist. And we can use the bicycle level of service tool to make a decision on what's an appropriate shoulder width. Because that tool was actually developed primarily to evaluate striped bike lanes, shoulders. So we're giving some guidance, and it tends to match up quite well actually with AASHTO Green Book design guidance for shoulders for roadways, for motorist safety. So there's not a lot of tension there. But another aspect of rural roads which is interesting is that we have places in rural communities where you want to go above and beyond the shoulder. National parks, this is a national park. You know, let's build some really high quality shared use paths. So maybe it's a cross-country bike road. You know, we've got some ambitious efforts underway to have cross-continental bike trails that go from East Coast to West Coast, north to south, and the idea is that you're not on a roadway. So let's have a national network of trails. They're going to go through rural areas, so we talk about that in the guide. We also talk about, you know, the charts are a starting point, but there's often can be some outlier conditions that people don't think about. And I actually experienced this in my own neighborhood. There's a street that is wonderful for cycling in a shared lane, 22 hours a day. But in the morning, there's 3 schools on this street. It doesn't go anywhere. It's dead ends at Union Station. And it's gridlocked. It has more traffic than an arterial street. And it's totally stressful. You can't bike on it. And so we actually have written into here a lot of other things that you got to think about, the nuance of your conditions of your street, and that you may make a decision not just on simplistic charts of average annual daily traffic in 24 hours, but you have something weird going on. We have a real unique peaking thing happening for a certain part of the day, and that may cause you to want to say, you know what, this should actually be upgraded. This is the kind of situation where Yeah, I get for 22 hours a day, it's fine, but we'd actually want to have a protected bike lane here or a path. Again, that's a choice. Another big one is streetcar. I live in a city that's doing a lot of streetcar. Seattle's doing it, Portland's got them, but they're killing cyclists. You know, the existing NEPA process doesn't make any accounting when you do a safety analysis of the future safety impacts of streetcar. And there'll be a little paragraph you'll see in these 800-page documents. Have you considered bike and ped safety? And they all say the same thing. It's a cut and paste. We've thought about it, we're fine, we've accommodated, but it's really super vague. And the reality is, we know streetcar tracks are dangerous and they kill cyclists. And that moving forward, if we're going to have streetcar systems and we're going to do planning for them, at the NEPA stage, we should be talking about the fact that they are dangerous and that it requires you provide a separated facility along the streetcar or you provide a parallel route. And that the federal funding should follow through that cycle to fund that parallel route if that's what's required, because we know that it is dangerous. So we talk about that in the guide. Jeremy mentioned this, this has been a long subject of debate, and a door zone bike lane is not great. There is some stress involved in that. But factually, through the research we've reviewed, it is in fact safer than doing nothing. And there's been a large segment of the engineering profession, and there's even in IT, accusations that creating a door zone bike lane versus doing nothing, that you are actually unethical if you put the door zone bike lane in. That you should only do a share. And it created, I don't know, we're up to 100 responses or something insane on that. But there's, again, it kind of goes back to this idea, the person that's really pushing it is the strong vehicular cyclist who cites John Forrester as a source of his material. He's not looking at the research, but yet he's opining consistently and trying to influence the profession. So I challenge all of you to read research. You don't have time to read it all, but read a little bit. And we got to engage and help educate our colleagues because there's a lot of misinformation out there that is doing damage. And then we talk about, and you go through your bikeway selection process. Now, obviously, we're trying to get the preferred facility, but the reality is we're not always going to get it. This is where there's a hang-up, especially at the DOT level. If we can't do it, what do we do? Well, do the best you can. We don't want people to give up. Like, if you can't have the gold standard protected bike lane, it doesn't mean don't do a normal striped bike lane. I like to call it the humble bike lane. Last night we were on an amazing bike ride with Roger through East Portland. I mean, really busy suburban roads, and we were talking about how hard it was to get a simple striped bike lane on those roads. In some cases require parking removal, road guides, and all we got is a bike lane. And it actually saddened me a little that some of the advocacy community really beats up public agencies for just doing a normal bike lane, when the reality was that was the best they could do, and the alternative was nothing, was a shared lane. That is actually a very challenging decision for the agency to move forward and remove parking just to get in this normal straight bike lane. We were able to ride last night throughout East Portland relatively safely. It wasn't always comfortable, but I was relatively safe. And we was even in darkness last night for part of our ride. But we were able to get around, and the thing that's impressive here in Portland is even though you have very low road share in the suburban parts of the city, you can get around by bike relatively safely. Now, I'm not going to take my dog around that road and the bike lane. I may be on the sidewalk, and that's another thing we talk about in the guide, is when you recognize who your design user is, you recognize the consequences of your choices, and that it may be the best you can do is the bike lane, but you should expect to see people riding on the sidewalk. That will happen, especially if they don't feel comfortable, especially if it's a bike lane on a 45-mile-an-hour road where it's got 40,000 cars a day of traffic. That we need to be more honest about the trade-off choices we're making, the implications of them, so that we understand what we're doing. And that if we look at an alternate route, and I want to give a shout out to Jennifer Dill sitting here and the whole Portland State crew. At this table, I mean, there's some of my favorite researchers in the business. They really think about it. Maybe part of it's because you're here in Portland, but they're just really thoughtful researchers. And it really, the importance of research can't be emphasized enough that we can start to understand, again, the trade-off choices we're making. We know that if you're going to have an alternate route, if it's more than 30%, if you're increasing the length of that trip over 30%, it may discourage use. And that's an important thing for our agencies to be aware of. question, yeah, go ahead.
Did you look at hills at all?
So hills is a good one, and I think that's an area that I'd love to see some more research on. We know hills can discourage use. I'm hoping with the increase of e-bikes that becomes a non-issue, but it is an issue. You know, and I think we can do a GIS analysis now, and actually in our firm we do this. We can do planning level analysis that consider terrain, but we can use some research that quantifies how much of a real deterrent different grades are.
But topography is mentioned in this chapter, something that you need to be considering as well as in the planning chapter.
Absolutely.
Bill?
Question there?
Yeah, sorry, I had a question on the last slide too, the 30% increase. I mean, that's really relative to what the original distance is.
Yeah.
What's that base distance? Because if you're increasing it 1/10 of a mile over 1/10 of a mile, then it's probably fine, but.
Yeah. That's a good question with Jennifer sitting right here. Yeah, I think it's been written a little more vaguely here to allow judgment in the context of your project. You know, I think most people would say if it's a mile, 2 miles, but that's still pretty far. I think a challenge we have is tying this together, like, well, what is the trip? How do I make that decision? That's a planning level decision. So I think that really comes back to a planning process that you're thinking about the density of your network. I think at a practical level in a corridor, it should just be, I think this is a helpful tool to allow us to kind of push back sometimes and just go use that other street, which is really what happens a lot right now. Especially in some of the DOT roads, just go use that local street. And so what we talk about in this guide is, okay, that's fine, but just go use that other street. Well, what's happening over here? Is there a signal? If I'm crossing a 7-lane road and I'm on the local street and there's no signal there, is that really an alternative? And we talk about that head on and say that if that whole thing is not a viable alternative, including the ability to safely cross the arterial roads, it's not an alternative. And then really, if you're going to say a parallel route is the option here, we can't help you on the street, well, what is your responsibility to help us achieve this? As the state agency who owns the green street, but not the purple one. But you're making your street unsafe. Should you help the local community help us make the purple street safe? And then when we're at your arterial crossing up here, should you put a signal in to help us cross the road so we can actually use this alternative route? And so we talk about the challenge of the warning system in here and say we need to be doing future volumes. And it's okay, and you got to think about the context of your project to make these decisions.
Just to your point there, would it be trip duration then? So if that signal or that lack of a signal there increases that crossing, it increases the duration is.
Yeah, I'd like to see the trip lane consider time as well, because I think that gets into a case where some of these can create a lot of extra time, which becomes a deterrent. So we talk about that in the guide as well, that you have to be thoughtful of this, the whole package, making this trade-off.
And does it address temporary conditions too? Because I know I'm
Temporary.
willing to go further out of my way for a temporary condition.
Yeah, we talk about work zones, we need to accommodate, it's in a more general nature, unfortunately, but it's an important aspect of this.
Yeah, this idea is also tied very closely to the legibility and connectivity of the network, and that it shouldn't be overly circuitous either. And then in the signals chapter is where we talk about the crossings of the intersection, that essentially, just as a pedestrian doesn't like to wait more than 30 seconds to cross the street, the research shows that the bicyclists are in the same boat. And so being very deliberate with that signal timing to create more frequent opportunities for people to cross, because if you don't, then they tend to make more risky behavior, which then leads to safety challenges. So with safety in mind as the high priority here, that really drives a lot of these decisions. Bill likes me to cover chapter 5 because it's a new chapter and is the bulk of the good content in the guide.
Yeah, I was curious about the language around parking lanes and if they're, when you say constrained, designing in a constrained environment, that might be superficially constrained if there's a parking lane, we're saying that can't be moved.
Mm-hmm.
What is, what sort of language addressing that?
It is not deliberate in saying how to make those choices. It helps you to weigh some of those options, but as a guide that has to be adopted by all states, we can't really be prescriptive about making those choices.
But I'll add, we do discuss parking, so we have a whole section in there that discusses how do I get space. It's framed that way, because a lot of what we're doing is retrofitting. And there's only a few ways to get space. Take out a lane of traffic, narrow lane of traffic, or get rid of parking. Those are really the three, or reconstruction, widen the road, which is rare. And so we do talk about it head on as a strategy. And we talk about it, and I'll get into it in a bit, but the idea of what does constrained mean? And I'll say it when we get to that point.
So, will you be focusing more on shared use paths, regional trails, including in urbanized areas?
Yeah, that'll be in another couple dozen slides here. So chapter 5 is where we have sort of embedded a lot of the content that used to be scattered throughout the old guide. So there used to be fundamental calculations in the shared use path chapter that are really applicable to a lot of other bikeway types. And so chapter 5 is kind of the go-to place for all the baseline information that you need to do the design. Specifically the design user, site distance, and then a lot of content about intersection design and the fundamental core principles that need to be upfront with all bikeway intersection types so that it will address issues of safety and comfort. So it talks a lot about the design user, that essentially the adult bicyclist is our design user as the largest and fastest bicyclist, but there are exceptions to this rule, that when we're looking at height for sight distance considerations, we need to really be looking at recumbent and child cyclists. If you just think of a yardstick, that's sort of what you need to be looking at, not a 6-foot eye height of an adult bicyclist on a conventional bike. We need to be using different speeds for the crossing speed of a bicyclist, and that essentially in a lot of cases that will actually be the pedestrian speed that will be the controlling speed. And then recognizing that when accommodating different types of bicycles, we need to be thinking about longer widths. So that's the bicycle that's pulling a trailer, tandems, other types of bikes that are longer than a conventional bike. So a lot of this content is the same as the last version of the guide, just baseline dimensions. But we also start to address other types of bikes that we see creeping up, whether that's the UPS delivery vehicles, e-scooters, and other vehicles that have different configurations than the conventional bikeway types. The other thing that we've sort of addressed in this guide that I hope that we've done a much better job on is this idea of separating the different spaces and what their intent is. Recognizing that the bicyclist only ever takes up the physical space that they occupy, and then this idea of operating space is what they need for the natural side-to-side motion that they feel comfortable. And this is particularly true of slower, less confident cyclists. The fast bicyclist that's going 25 miles an hour, they're sitting on rollers all day and they can just go in a perfectly straight line. Whereas somebody that's biking at 11 miles an hour is probably going to be a little bit more wobbly, and that needs to be baked into the design decisions about the widths that we're providing, regardless of what that bikeway type is. And then in addition to those spaces, we need to accommodate the shy space from the things around us, whether that's a curb, a tree, a signpost, etc. And so the guide identifies specific shy distances for each of those different types. So again, recognizing that you only ever occupy the space that you occupy, but you need that operating space to accommodate that natural side-to-side motion. And so we're also talking a lot about social cycling, this idea that when you're riding in a car, you want to talk to your passenger. The same thing holds true for people on bikes. You see this a lot on shared use paths, that they're built too narrow, and so you're trying to have a conversation yelling over your shoulder. That's not really social cycling. And so we need to accommodate widths where we can to accommodate this natural idea that people want to ride side by side. And usually this is just a matter of providing a couple extra inches over what we were doing before to make this comfortable, but it's a fundamental shift in the design approach to accommodate this type of behavior. The other thing that we talk about a lot in the guide is this idea of curb types, and we'll get into that in separated bike lanes, but recognizing that we have to be deliberate in the choice of curb design, whether that's vertical curb, mountable, sloping, and then this idea of gutter pan, that gutter pan might be great for conveying drainage, but it's kind of throwing space away because bicyclists will not ride on that groove or anywhere near it, and so we need to be deliberate in those design decisions as well. But recognizing that when we're providing narrower spaces, all we're going to accommodate is occasional passing. It's not going to be comfortable for people to ride side by side, but it's easy for them to pass somebody in the instant that they need to. And to illustrate this, we have a slick little graphic. Remember, it's just the instant that the bicyclist is next to the other bicyclist that we have to accommodate the physical space of both of those users and shy space between them. So we don't have enough width for the operating width and shy space, but we don't need it because it's just ding, 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 I'm passing on your left. You have that instant that you're passing them, and then you proceed on your way. So that's really what these widths are going to accommodate, whereas social cycling, the widths are going to allow for the natural side-to-side motion and the shy spaces that we need between those users. So that's what you need to recognize when we're talking about the widths of these facilities.
A quick question. Will you be sharing this presentation with the group?
We cannot share the presentation, so feel free to take photos, ask questions, but we can't share the slides.
You should go back 2 slides just for one slide just for a second.
Yeah, so this is illustrating that you're occupying physical space and you're providing the shy space between them, right? You don't have the operating space baked into this graphic, whereas in the previous one, you're providing shy space between the operating space of both of those users. That's what you need to feel comfortable riding side by side. And again, it's not going to be true of all cyclists. There's plenty of cyclists that can ride in a straight line and feel comfortable riding 6 inches away from somebody else who's similarly confident. But when we're thinking about this different design user, we have to have these ideas in mind to accommodate that operation.
Quick question back to the first one. The 140. So, I went there, I had the 2-foot preferred, but is that the width that's there? Or is there a minimum that should be considered for any kind of vertical element?
So there are different shy distances for each element, and for bollards or flex posts, we allow that to go down to 0.
But if that were like a planter, then you'd say the 1 foot minimum?
Planters, I'm trying to remember, I think they're, 1 foot minimum, and this has to do with whether they're, like, a planter is going to be more of a fixed object as well, so similar to a wall or a fence, a long linear object, that's something that you're not going to feel comfortable riding very close to with your handlebar basically touching the wall. And,
Do you have any variations of the width for two-way traffic?
Yeah, so there's different widths for one-way versus two-way facilities. We'll dive more into that in the separated bike lane chapter. So in terms of design speed, there's more of a range to be thinking about now. That generally we're talking about designing separated bike lanes and shared use paths for a 15-mile-an-hour design speed, not 30 miles an hour. Recognizing that 18 to 30 might be appropriate for a shared use path, depending on the context of what that path is, and also recognizing that your context may change along the length of a path. So for example, if you have a shared use path going through a more dense area with lots of trailheads, probably more pedestrian traffic, you probably don't want to design that as a 30-mile-an-hour recreational cycle path. But if you're dealing with a longer, more rural or suburban with few trailheads, it might be okay to accommodate those high speeds, and that might change along the length of that trail. Again, context really matters when we're talking about design. And again, variations on different speeds for different facility types. We also do talk about that e-bikes have the ability to go 20 miles an hour before, and I mean, they can go faster than that with your, if you're pedaling faster. So we do touch on that in the guide, but we also recognize that it's still appropriate to design, for example, a separated bike lane for a 15-mile-an-hour design speed, and that it might not be appropriate to go 20 miles an hour on that facility. This is not a new term in the guide, but its application is much larger because we're talking about separated bike lanes, this idea of mutual yielding. And this is true for every shared use path crossing that's ever been developed and every pedestrian crossing as well. This idea that a pedestrian can't suddenly step out into a crosswalk and expect that the motorist is going to be able to yield, and recognizing that everybody has a responsibility in these situations to navigate it in a safe and comfortable manner. And so the key thing is to make sure that you have enough space for each user to see each other, make a decision about what they're supposed to do, and then actually engage in that decision, stopping it or yielding for that design decision. We also talked about stopping sight distance in the guide, lots of different sight distances. So it's 8 now instead of, I think there were 5 in the last version of the guide. 5 of these are for separated bike lanes because this is just new information that wasn't in the last version of the guide. And then we've also tried to be deliberate about giving you better charts and things so that you don't always have to run the calculations. There's more lookup tables to simplify this. We found that when we give you just an equation, we often don't do the whole calculation and you simplify it. Whereas if we give you a lookup table, it's easier to actually implement it. So the first one I'll talk about is for separated bike lanes, bike case A as we call it. This is for separated bike lanes at an intersection, and this idea that it's going to depend on who gets to that intersection first. Is the motorist going to get there first, or is the bicyclist going to get there first? And all of this is really contingent on what is the intersection design speed for the motorist. So it doesn't really matter whether this road is a 35-mile-an-hour road or a 25-mile-an-hour road. What really matters is what is the effective turning radius at this intersection, and how fast or slowly must a driver go around that corner to navigate it safely. That's all going to determine how much sight distance we need. Rather than giving you long, complex formulas for that, again, we've given you a lookup table. So based on the effective turning radius, we have an identified vehicular turning speed, and then how much space you need on the approach for those users to see each other. So when you can slow the vehicle down, you need less space. When you're allowing that vehicle to turn quickly around the corner, you're going to need a lot more space for those users to see and react to each other. Same thing holds true for the left turn across a two-way separated bike lane. This motorist is going to be able to see the motorist coming in the opposite direction as long as you've already provided the approach clear space up here. But you have this unique challenge of the motorist being able to see the bicyclist that's traveling in the same direction as them, and that you similarly need the same amount of approach clear space for that situation. This is really only applicable for two-way separated bike lanes.
Question? How did you come up with the vehicle turning speeds for those radii? They seem pretty fast.
So the turn speeds came from a couple different sources of research, but it was based on observed speeds of motorists through things like right turn slip lanes and other locations like that. And rather than using the average, we veered more towards what is the highest vehicle speed that we're generally seeing around those corners, because we want to make sure that that is accommodated so that the bicyclist and the motorist have enough time to react to those locations. These numbers do differ from what is in the AASHTO Green Book, which focused on the comfort of a motorist going around the corner.
And they differ not just a little bit, but
Right.
like threefold. Okay.
Quickly then, because it is the effective vehicle radius based on the radius calculated if it's like several lanes to the farthest possible one.
Right.
Would also define the radius, not going into the specific right.
Right, driver behavior and the design of the intersection all factor into this decision. Yep.
Is this one where the speed of the bike or e-bike or scooter was factored into that, like a 20 is fulfill like a, or I guess I'm just curious, like what was the design speed assumed for the bike?
The design speed for the bike was 15 miles an hour with adjustment. So again, there's research that points to the fact that a bicyclist approaching an intersection is not accelerating into that intersection, that they're actually being more diligent, and we find through the research that they're often lowering their speed a little, and that's all baked into this design guidance as well. With separated bike lanes, we also have this challenge of how do motorists that are exiting the side streets or driveways deal with that interaction, and what types of safe distance do we need for this to accommodate both users. And so in some situations, you may have this configuration where the motorist is going to end up blocking the separated bike lane. And that may be okay for your context, and it may not. And so you have to make that design decision as part of the design of each intersection. So the guide gives you two scenarios for that type of interaction. One is where the motorist first looks for crossing pedestrians, then they move forward to a point where they can see a bicyclist in the separated bike lane. That's what the vehicle code tells them they have to do. Actually, I remember taking my driver's test, and the person that was administering it saying that I did the right thing because I stopped before the crosswalk and then encroached in it to the point where I could see the oncoming motorist. It's what drivers naturally do. So they can first look for the bikes, and then they may proceed into the bike lane to get a line of sight for a motorist. So when you have on-street parking, that's often going to be the case, that they're going to need to advance forward to see past those cars and may or may not block the bike lane. This will also be contingent on how much buffer space you provide between the separated bike lane and the edge of the travel lane, right? The other scenario is if you're trying to accommodate all of that from one location. So in this instance, the motorist is trying to assess line of sight to the bicyclist as well as to the motorist from the same point. And what this is often going to mean in an urban environment is that you would end up stripping out all this parking to accommodate that. And I've gotten into discussions with folks in Philadelphia about this, that if you look at all your intersections today, you're not accommodating this. So the notion that because we're doing a separated bike lane, you have to give 350 feet of sight distance from this far back really just doesn't match up with what we're already doing today. But recognizing that this might be an appropriate treatment in some locations. Separated bike lane has very high volumes of traffic. Blocking it is probably not going to be an option. If you have a one-way separated bike lane, you're probably going to end up blocking it. Whereas if you had a two-way, you might still have space for the bicyclist to get behind a motorist that is partially blocking that bike lane. Again, context really matters. And then also recognizing that we have to look at cross traffic for the motorist that is crossing that same street but from the far side, and making sure that they can see oncoming bicyclists. When we talk about intersection configuration, there are a couple core principles that are really baked throughout all of this design guidance. Primarily, it's minimizing the exposures and sort of the vehicle operation at these locations so that we're able to clearly communicate who has the right-of-way and make sure that that intersection will function appropriately. And part of this is when we look at conventional intersections, oftentimes the whole intersection becomes one big difficult conflict point, right? A bicyclist that's trying to turn left in a conventional manner has to cross all these travel lanes and is going to interact with a lot of bicyclists in those locations. Whereas when we look at protected intersections, we're able to minimize those conflicts to just one point, and even that point can be managed based on signal timing and those sorts of things. So focusing on those core principles, making sure that we're sort of addressing them and deliberately at each design. We also know from pedestrian research that is applicable to bicyclists that based on the characteristics of the road, the yielding percentage for motorists can drop way, way down. So when we have higher speed roads or roads that are more than 2 lanes wide, we see that motorists tend to not yield to bicyclists, which really points to this idea that we need to apply different countermeasures to get the yielding performance that we want. And so a lot of our guidance for this is based on the same research that influenced the FHWA STEPS guide. Still taking photos, good. So the FHWA STEPS guide, I hope you're all familiar with this one, really speaks to this idea that you have different street characteristics and therefore need to apply different countermeasures to make it safe and comfortable for a pedestrian to cross. Before this guide comes out, you can continue to use that guidance for providing guidance for bicycle crossings, particularly at bicycle boulevard crossings. But we'll have this chart in the AASHTO Bike Guide to address what countermeasure is appropriate for a bike boulevard crossing, whether that's just signing in markings is okay because it's lower volume, lower speeds, only crossing a couple lanes. Whereas when you have higher volumes, more lanes, you need to be thinking about rapid flashing beacons or potentially signalization of some sort. And then we get into the actual intersection design treatments themselves, the different countermeasures and techniques that you can use to influence driver behavior and allow that crossing to be more comfortable for a bicyclist. So one of them is truck aprons. I feel like this is a very underutilized treatment that we can be using to control the effective corner radius for the vast majority of vehicles that are going through an intersection while still accommodating the larger vehicle. This is one from San Francisco, right? And I think this design's really slick. You know, it's marked out as a truck apron. It doesn't look like much, but when you look at it from the other angle, you have a little bit of a curb reveal here, and we just find that most motor vehicles will not drive over that. So you're really able to control driver performance through a minor change at an intersection while still accommodating your fire trucks and delivery vehicles that might be a little bit larger. We also talk about bike ramps. In the last version of the guide, I believe the only place that bike ramps were mentioned were at roundabouts. So we've been more deliberate about giving guidance about these different configurations. The preferable design is going to be one where a bicyclist is able to cross the joint of your ramp in a perpendicular manner. You still can use this option of making it kind of skewed, but recognizing that based on your bicycle design vehicle, that may present safety and operational challenges for them to navigate a ramp like this. Think about it this way, you have an adult tricycle or you're pulling a trailer. If you try and go over this ramp in this configuration, you're going to have one wheel up on the ramp while the other one is still down on the road. So it creates a situation where you have a little bit of an overturning issue. So in those situations, we recommend a little bit wider width so that a bicyclist could swing a little bit wider to navigate that in a way that they're naturally going to do anyway to feel comfortable going over that ramp. And so being deliberate about that in the design. The last choice that we have is the use of directional indicators, which the FHWA Shared Street Guide was the first one to really include this treatment. And so we've identified it as a way to still provide accessibility choices for the pedestrian. They would interact with this strip and be directed to the sidewalk rather than the other configurations that use the detectable warning surfaces at the tops of the ramps.
Does this guidance then prescribe the max grade for that ramp at 5% or something?
I think we had it.
Yeah, we give a range.
Question on the last slide. When we developed the bike ramp guidance for roundabouts, we purposely didn't put one at the top, which is certainly better for bicyclists, but it was, even with the detected warnings, it was such a concern for people who are concerned about people who are blind or have low vision. Was that something that kind of was rehashed as this discussion and kind of said, okay, it's okay to do this? How did that
The need to accommodate people with disabilities was baked into all of this guidance and what was the source of a lot of discussion throughout the development of these different treatments. And I think that's why we also have the idea of the directional indicator, because it helps to direct them away from the ramp rather than interacting with it at all. But again, it was a lot of discussion throughout all these different treatments, and things like separated bike lanes were just not in the vocabulary when ADA was developed, and so we're sort of continuing to feel this out. And I'm sure we will still continue to see changes as these things are implemented. But a lot of this was based on the research that was done as part of that FHWA shared street guide about user expectation in those types of environments.
Jeremy, I might want to talk to you later about this, but there's questions about placement of the DWS strip, and also do you provide guidance? I think there's still a conversation going on nationally about what direction the DWS needs to be, and you prescribe what the directional indicator is, and whether you can use directional DWS in other cases.
Yeah, and that's why we were also very deliberate in the guide to just say that you must comply with accessibility guidelines, and we were not prescriptive about what that always means, because we recognize that this is going to continue to be an evolving area. So the best that we can do is say, make sure that you're complying with accessibility guidelines. But both of these options match what's currently in that MUTCD as well as the last version of the AASHTO. And then lastly, in 5, we talk about the different types of markings and signs that you should be considering. So the use of the turning vehicles, yield to bikes and ped sign, different wrong way, and other signs that you can use. And a lot of this goes beyond, for both the signs and the markings, goes beyond what's currently in the MUTCD. So we identified when things require a request to experiment and those that have interim approval in this document, because we want it to be in everybody's toolkit, whether they have those interim approvals for their state or jurisdiction yet, they should be aware of that so that they can then apply for those approvals. So some examples of that are the 2-stage turn box and the green markings. So every time one of these treatments is identified in the guide, it says you're required to get a request to experiment, or you need to have the interim approval in order to use this treatment. But we wanted to make sure it was in this guide, not just reliant on the update for the MUTCD, because we don't know which one would be released first.
So chapter 6 is shared use paths, and it's an area that tried to address what I would argue are some historical deficiencies in this. So we've designed the minimum too much on shared use paths. I think there's good reasons for that. We're often in sensitive environments, we're trying to fit it in, but I think we've done a real disservice of calling a lot of these in communities bike paths, in communities where we're not providing safe alternative streets for people to bike on, and then all the cyclists are out there, and you get a wide mix of cyclists who are going fast and training or just wanting exercise mixed in with a lot of pedestrians, and it engenders a lot of conflict. And it's unfortunate. And so we're trying to head that, being more direct about this, that the idea of the social aspect of cycling and walking can't be ignored. We're not going to social engineer people to ride single file and walk single file. When you think about our transportation environment, it's designed for socialization. The car, the passenger seat, it's got the group, the bus, the train, but for some reason, when it came to walking and cycling, because we're trying to squeeze it into a car-centric environment, we're going to pretend that people walk single file, they bike single file, define human nature, and it doesn't work. And it leads to all sorts of operational problems and safety problems. So we talk about that. That has really got to be fundamental in the designer's thinking when they're designing a shared use path, that people are going to walk side by side, they're going to bike side by side, and every person you see in these photos is exactly what they're doing. And if you're not thinking about that at the beginning of your design process, and accounting for that behavior, and you're thinking about the potential volumes on your trail, you should anticipate conflict, and in fact, injuries. Because we know when we actually are not, these aren't going to be police-reported injuries generally. We're going to find them in the hospital. When we actually look at the hospital records, we're finding upwards of 50 to 60% of crashes that are unreported are collisions between people in environments such as this. And it engenders, again, I think the most unfortunate aspect of this history of this is we've created an enormous amount of conflict between people walking and people cycling who are natural, should be allies in livable communities. We need to do a better job of design. And so some tools. This tool's been around for a long time. Federal Highway helped fund this research. Shared use path level of service, and I find very few people are using it. I don't know if they think it's too complicated or not, but it's a simple spreadsheet tool. And you can download for free from Federal Highway's website. But again, the aspect of trying to institutionalize this a little bit and put it more directly into the AASHTO guide. We've explained, what are our targets? I mean, we've been talking about level of service forever, and it's dictated built outcomes in our road system. Well, we have a level of service for shared use paths, let's start to use it. And we're recommending in the AASHTO guide a target of C. And that's when the path's close to functional capacity. Let's kind of take advantage of this level of service system and identify conditions that we're shooting for. And we really want to try to allow for these things to be safe. And we've created lookup tables. Well, how much is your shared use path peak hour volume going to be? How wide is the trail? Well, here's the level of service. We just ran all the numbers for you. We assumed a mode split because this accounts for people walking, running, on bikes. So you can change it, but we put in a default mode split and did some lookup tables to make it easy for you. We took those lookup tables and then turned them into recommended trail widths. Because again, this was in the 1974 guide. I think this is sort of the tiers part of our discussion of, what, in some ways we could have not done this and maybe just reprinted the 1974 guide and called it a day. Because it was really quite good in many ways. So we look back to that for inspiration, and we tried to bring a lot of it in, and we have a table now. We should be thinking about these paths as having lanes. How many lanes do you want? Do you want to promote social cycling? Then you need at least 3 lanes, unless it's very low volume. If it's a busy trail, how about 4 lanes? And we do this for motorists all the time, and we don't second guess it. We talk about trails, it's suddenly controversial. That we're going to spend all this money on a wider trail. We don't want it to look like a highway. We don't want to have striping on it. I mean, it's crazy. We want it to be safe and functional. So what are the design criteria we have? What is the expected volumes we're going to have? And what are kind of minimum widths? And then how does it, and when we actually have, this is baked in, this is a volume when it trips over in a level of service D, which starts to become a problem. That's when you start to have conflicts with people. So an 8-foot trail width that has 300 users an hour is going to be really failing. You're going to have conflicts. You really only can handle about 50 people an hour. And we have thousands of miles of 8 and 10-foot trails in this country that have a lot of safety problems. This one's in my own neighborhood, Maryland, and it is huge complaints all the time about safety issues. There's talk of banning cyclists at times, or we need speed limits. So we want to get away from that. So we really head this on directly. That really, this is fine for low volume, it can be narrower, but once you get into high volume situations, you're going to have conflict, and we need to really, there's a point of actually it'd be better for everybody to separate. We're actually working with the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority to separate the W&OD Trail. One of the busiest trails in the United States. We're widening it out to 20 feet. They're slowly getting the funding together. They're slowly going to separate peds from cyclists so that it's actually a safe facility and actually an enjoyable facility. We got to talk about the experience of it for people. Again, taking advantage, we put this in the Federal Highway multimodal guide. The idea, there's different ways of doing it. One of the reasons Minneapolis sometimes beats out Portland, there's the trade, who's the best cycling city. But the thing that Minneapolis has that Portland doesn't is they had a lot of abandoned railroads where they went in and they had grade separated, and they defaulted 20 years ago to 20 20-foot standard trail width, which blows a lot of people's minds to hear that number. And they separated just with a stripe, people walking from bike lane, and it's uniform. They've got an amazing trail system, and now they're trying to add in an on-run system to complement that. But fundamentally, it started with a really, really great trail system. So we're bringing all those concepts. There's all sorts of different ways to separate and giving the designer some ideas to think about it. Again, we talk about the idea of shy space. We bring all those basic concepts in, thinking about how people operate. And then, what happens when you're next to fences and barriers and walls and trees and all those things that are out there. And we talk about intersections and, the sad reality. I always kind of check myself, but it's amazing how often we have to make it more dangerous for cyclists because of bad motorist behavior. I got to install bollards because drivers are driving down the trail. I got to make it more dangerous for cyclists because the motorists are being reckless. And that's a default. And there's too many trail systems that presumed it would be dangerous and put in bollards. And there have been multi-million-dollar lawsuits and judgments filed against public transportation agencies for having a one-size-fits-all bollard policy that has paralyzed people. And so this is starting to change. And we're giving other ideas of how to restrict the bad actors with other design strategies. And it can be as simple as thinking, how about we try a flexible post? And why is it always going to be a steel thing that could really injure you? Why don't we start? And so we really discuss in an iterative way of let's do the least harm and build up. There could be places where people are going nuts and you got to put the steel bollards in. But why do we have to start with the most extreme solution first and kind of have a more thoughtful approach to this? That's a quick overview of trails.
All right, next up is separated bike lanes, and it's important to note that we've actually lumped separated bike lanes and side paths together in this chapter because they have fundamental similarities when we get to intersections. And so that's really why these were combined. When we're talking about the widths of them, you still turn to Chapter 6 for shared use path guidance. But when it comes to the intersections, we'll lump them together like this. So a lot of this content is already in the MassDOT guide. We used that as the sort of starting off point and made some modifications where appropriate. Really talks about the different zones as part of a separated bike lane. You have the bike lane itself, the buffers on either sides, and then everything else in your street. Again, recognizing that we would need to accommodate people of all ages and abilities, as well as people with disabilities, so that's very deliberate anytime we're talking about crossings of the separated bike lane. Different types of curbs, and these curbs actually come straight from the AASHTO Green Book, so I know some jurisdictions don't do sloping curb, but it's in the Green Book, and if they're saying, well, we follow the Green Book, it's already in there. But being very deliberate with the choice of curb, because when you have a vertical curb or a curb with gutter pan, the bicyclist will naturally shy away from those locations. Whereas if you're deliberate and you select a sloping curb or a mountable curb, it's then comfortable for a bicyclist to bike basically right up against that. They're not afraid of pedal strikes. So it really opens up the width of your facility to accommodate, somebody that's going to be comfortable biking along there. And so in terms of the width, we've then been deliberate based on the type of curb or other vertical element that might be adjacent to it, that we've then specified the width of the bicycle facility, bike way, based on those constraints. So when you're between two vertical curbs, that's the most challenging location because you're going to shy away from the curb on both sides. So that's 6.5 feet, whereas when you're at a sidewalk level or not adjacent to a curb, a separated bike lane that's 5.5 feet wide may be okay. But you also have to recognize with these widths that some of these lower end values and certainly the constraint condition values are not going to accommodate side-by-side riding. They'll accommodate occasional passing in some instances, but things like the constraint width should really only be used for very short distances. So for example, behind a floating bus stop or behind accessible parking. But we made sure to give a range here based on not only those physical constraints, but also the anticipated volume of bicyclists. And it's important to think that it's the anticipated volume, not what's currently on that street. So building that into the planning process as well as the design process.
Does it go into, you mentioned the grates, moving grates and retrofitting existing, and also utilities and other things that might be there already?
I mean, it does talk about grades. It's not prescriptive about how you're supposed to do it, but it does point to the idea that the bicyclist is not going to ride next to a gutter pan. If you're providing inlet grades, they have to be bicycle safe, but recognizing that some bicyclists are not going to ride over that. But again, that's sort of a constraint issue as well. I often say that it really comes down to the inches matter for all of these designs. So when you have the gutter pan, you're kind of throwing that space away, and it means you need a wider bikeway to accommodate that side-by-side riding. The other thing we do mention in the guide is that if you're going to provide a gutter pan, consider providing it for the whole width of the bike lane. So if you have an asphalt road, you can have a 6.5 foot wide gutter pan that's going to be concrete. It's going to be visually different from the adjacent roadway, so that in and of itself will also help, but it means that that joint is then located in the buffer between the bikeway and the road, so that it does then become functional space.
Can you address the need for a gutter pan at all? I mean, it's ubiquitous, but I've read accounts from people from very places that say that they would water just as well without it.
Again, it's because this has to be approved by all the state DOTs. There's many state DOTs that simply don't use gutter pan, and there's other ones that are adamant that they have to have it. And so in order to accommodate all of those types of designs, we've allowed for it, but we've also mentioned the idea of changing that configuration. Certainly here in Portland, they have different widths of the gutter pan, a 6-inch gutter pan. Maybe that's all you need. I've also heard different concerns about why they're providing it. Some think it's for conveyance, others think that it's so that the water doesn't seep down along that joint. Many DOTs have solved these problems. I'm not sure why it's still an issue, but yeah.
Bill, you were a water guy.
Wastewater.
Yeah, I mean, the history of the gutter is an interesting one, and it's not really fully documented, but it's easier to control the joint with concrete for drainage, making sure that it fully gets in there. But, I come from New England, and then you go to Canada, and they don't use them. So I'm like, well, we talk about water, and I'm working down in the South, and they insist on 2-foot gutters in Texas, and California, North Carolina. I go to Canada, and they get a ton of snow. You can't tell me they're not dealing with water, and there's no gutter. So it's really habit and policy preference that the different state adopted 90 years ago that no one's questioning and challenging, and they just keep going. And it's a point that I'd like to see a little more research on and push back, but I think there's so much of this is changing habits. People are so used to doing things the same way. And so what we've talked about a lot in the guide is just recognizing that, if you're going to put cyclists over there, then you got to think about the experience for them, and you may want to change your standards. And it's not the end of the world. There's ways to solve it. But, we give the options, but we can't make people do this. So, again, as an AASHTO document, as Jeremy says, we give a lot of options, which really should empower you to have the conversation with your agency to say there's other ideas here, and this is why it matters.
I happily push back when doing projects in jurisdictions that have gutter pan to say, we don't need this, and I could justify it 10 different ways. Similar approach for the two-way separated bike lanes. It matters what curve you're between, but naturally a two-way separated bike lane is often already going to accommodate side-by-side riding, particularly at those lower volumes. The directionality will also matter. How many bikes do you have going in each direction? But we tend to find that you need a little less width for the two-way designs. And that's also why we're often seeing some jurisdictions implementing two-way versus one-way, is that you only have one street buffer, and when we're talking about inches really matter, a 2 or 3 foot street buffer on both sides of the street versus on one is sometimes the deciding factor between being able to provide a separated bike lane in a retrofit versus not being able to provide it. But again, it's all based on volumes and what your adjacent considerations are. It also talks about the different elevations that you can be considering. Sidewalk elevation, it has its pros, it has its cons. It really elevates you up away from the roadway, but can present challenges with sidewalk interaction and accessibility, particularly if you don't have a detectable sidewalk buffer here. If this is all concrete, and then you have your bike lane, we've given no indication to the blind pedestrian that they have wandered into the bike lane. So the guide does address that as well. The street level, which is what we find most of our retrofits are done as, we're not changing the curb line, so we're down at street level. And then the intermediate level option, which is usually my preferred go-to as a personal choice. And this is often just because from a grading perspective at intersections, it can make it a little easier when I'm dealing with bus platforms. Grading that out and making it ADA accessible tends to be a little bit easier with this option. But you also don't need to have a continuous elevation for the length of your corridor. So you can have street level separated bike lanes, and then as you approach intersections, you can change that, or vice versa. It can be sidewalk elevation and then ramp down to street level as you approach the intersection.
I have a question about the detectable edge for sidewalk level when there is a sidewalk adjacent, what you guys suggest.
Give me like 4 slides on that.
With the intermediate level, then also, does that change the standards in terms of whether you do a vertical curve or a diagonal curve with this only 2 dimensions? So if you were looking at your constraints, you wouldn't have to necessarily have to have that extra width.
Right, so the 2 or 3 inch reveal curve can be vertical. You're not going to be worried about pedal strikes with that, but it does then sometimes present challenges of the bicyclist not being able to perceive that it's a vertical curve. And so you may still want to do a small bevel on it so that if they're trying to exit out to access bike parking and things like that. And that's really the best use of the mountable curve is when you have maybe a bike share station back here and you want to give easy access from the separated bike lane to that location. The use of the mountable curve is naturally going to accommodate.
Just a transition to a mountable like that.
Yeah, and again, that can change along the length of your corridor too, based on the context. So you can be deliberate in selecting that curve type. But what we found in the shared streets guide is this sort of 2 or 3 inch reveal is detectable for people with disabilities. So if you're using a cane, you're going to be able to track that and know that there's a vertical edge there. We'll go back here.
Hey, amazing details. Can I just ask you guys to talk a bit about a big picture question and approach to the guide? And this picture sort of illustrates it. When we isolate the bike facilities, you talk about this a bit, we're also designing for the pedestrians and the motor vehicles and other users that are still on the street. And sometimes in having practice this, when we focus on the bike or on the bike facility, we forget some things, and the backlash we get comes from some of the things we think about with the other users. Like, we talk about doors on biking. We've had doors on driving, so like you're rendering there, we're focused on the bikeway, but the shopper who has to get out of the car, the driver's seat's opening their car in that particular drawing. So like the parking lane width and the trade-offs, the parking lane width we might want on a 30-mile-an-hour street so that the shopper on that street, when they open their car, doesn't feel like they're going to get run over or their car's going to get solid. So I guess big picture thinking about it, obviously this is the whole profession and the trade-offs and interactions, you open a can of worms that one next, but like the other users, including the motor vehicles in that design.
Yes. So the width of that buffer is going to be contingent on how much space you generally have. We have 2 foot.
Not the buffer, the other side. I'm talking the other side, between the car lane and the parking lane. You have a parking lane in your cross section.
Between the car lane and the parking lane.
The passengers
This right here.
Yeah, you're thinking about the buffer for the bike and the car, but the driver getting out and interacting with the moving lane, like that, how much you get for that will decide how much you have for your buffer. You're sort of deciding who gets, does the driver getting out in the moving lane get enough buffer, or the one between the bike line? You're often deciding between those two things.
Right, so that choice of whether to do a 7-foot wide, very narrow parking lane versus an 8-foot, we don't specifically address that. We do address the interaction here between the door and the bike lane, but I think that's going to be a decision that each agency is also going to individually address on what their policy is. And it may be that when you have a separated bike lane like this, agencies are going to say, this needs to be an 8-foot wide parking lane. And people are going to load and unload from the travel lane, which they would have done if there was no conventional bike lane or anything like that. So it's sort of natural on-street parking behavior. It's just in a conventional bike lane scenario, they're using the bike lane to accommodate that loading and unloading.
Hey, Jeremy, before you go, can you talk a little bit more about your street buffer, not Brian's point, but the elevation? Like, so you're dropping down 3 inches for the bike lane, and then you're coming back up, and then you're going back down to the street. Like, have you done this a lot? Is this kind of like, I've never done it.
I think some of the designs in Boston have that. And when we're talking about precast curve, that has that configuration where you're having a raised median, you would have to step down and across it if you had on-street parking. What it does mean is you need to be thinking about accessible parking in locations that need to have accessible parking. And we'll have that in a few slides, but...
And drainage.
And drainage, right.
You can't just run it off.
Well, and the thing about these designs, at intermediate level, you can choose which direction you want the water to go. So if you want to have your trunk line here, because you're doing a full street reconstruction, you can then slope that towards that inlet structure. Whereas if it's your existing trunk line is already here, you can choose to slope it through there, and then you need an additional structure.
Do we need the cycle tracks in Northern Europe have this design? Do they pop back up like this?
So most of the ones in, say, the Netherlands will often have intermediate level and they'll have a small inlet grate, really small, to capture storm water within that.
Do they come back up to sidewalk line?
Intermediate is sort of
In the street buffer?
Yeah, side street crossing.
Have I seen this?
Yeah.
And they don't have to either. You can keep it at sidewalk level or intermediate and then have a raised crossing when we get to the intersection, depending on the characteristic of your intersection, how much volume is going across that location.
And that's more standard in the Netherlands, because we use that to get the key to drive to the lower tier.
Right. And you have
Thinking about the other users, this looks very similar to Main Avenue in DC, and noticing where you have sort of that separation. It's this brand new, sparkling bikeway, different colors, concrete. People are still using the sidewalk as they used it before, and this is kind of part of their idea of the sidewalk. So look at their groups, at bus stops or at crosswalks in the bikeway. And because there's those physical elements in the middle separating you from the walkway, you're kind of pegged in between that and then the delivery vehicles. So I'm wondering if there's any recommendations on whether or not to include those options. Like if you have a choice of planting trees in the middle there, or if it's along the street buffer, so the sidewalk buffer, like negotiating, I guess, between and what you're going to actually find with user behavior. And education can go so far, but intuition.
And I think that's another one of those context-sensitive decisions, that when you're in the urban core, it may be appropriate to be doing your street trees here, sort of define the sidewalk environment with those different types of treatments. In other locations, it might be important to put the tree buffer here because you're trying to tie it together with green street infrastructure. So the context of it really matters. And the guide really does hit on that over and over again, that the context matters, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer, that every block really needs to be looked at based on what the operations of the adjacent businesses or properties are, and making sure all of that is accommodated with the design, or you're setting yourself up for failure. So the guide also talks about the different types of street buffer treatments that you can use, and sort of the pros and cons of each of them, what the benefits are and what you need to be thinking about. So raised medians really gives you a good sense of separation. It's a physical element. It gives you these opportunities to incorporate green street infrastructure, but they also tend to be a little bit more expensive. Same thing goes for the precast option. So this is a sort of a larger capital improvement project. This represents a precast curb in Austin. One thing that we found in some areas with the precast curb is we're getting really high prices from contractors because it's very costly for them to cast it, move it around at the plant, bring it to the site, deliver it, move it around on site. And so being very deliberate with the sizes of these when you're speccing them out can also really matter. We did a similar treatment in Houston, and the lengths of them were much smaller. So more segments of it, but it was easier for the contractor to handle, and so we got much better prices for that.
So is that up 3 inches, the bike lane? Or is that?
No, that's at street level. This was a retrofit
Okay,
design.
so this has the little curve, like the precast curve. You don't have to work at the drainage because the units and so you can drain.
Right.
And then that's a 7-inch curve, 6-7 inch curve.
Mhm.
So this is sort of,
Yeah, so you always have different options about how you're going to handle the drain.
did you cast it? Did you cast that flat curve?
That's a precast curve.
No, no, the flat one.
This one.
No.
In front.
That. Oh, that.
What is that?
I think that might be mountable.
That's
That
actually,
might all be flush.
that's a full height curve. It's not obvious in the photo.
That's a full height curve.
Yeah, you're approaching the intersection where they did an island.
But there's also going to be situations where you're going to want that to be flush, with accessible loading, those sorts of things.
And with this guidance also lend itself, I guess, there's a lot of emerging like design, like curb rail and bike rail that are more modular, that have sometimes more temporary uses that actually are bolted and can be to some degree semi-permanent as an alternative to say these types of precast. I mean, I know that the cost and actually installation of those are significantly lower. Is that something that fits in this?
So what it does talk about is that when you're dealing with retrofits, things like flex post or bike rail are probably going to be your options. It also talks about things that we put in that with the footrests, you don't need to worry about the shy distance because the expectation is you're supposed to be using that to set your foot out on. So it does cover those things as well.
I have a question, I guess a comment about the design of some of these and the factor of snow storage. Working in Boulder, Colorado, and we get a ton of snow, and there are some designs that are more amenable to snow storage versus others, and I'm wondering if you included snow storage as a potential challenge, listing a potential challenge in the designs.
Yeah, the maintenance piece is now its own chapter, and it talks both about snow removal and storage as well as street sweeping, and this idea that if you're thinking about implementing a one-way separated bike lane, particularly like a 6.5 foot wide one, that may require investment in other equipment. In some cases, that may, for snow removal, may require you to pick the snow up and put it in a dump truck, which some jurisdictions are already doing. And in others, it might be the deciding factor about how wide you're going to make one of these buffers, whether that's the street or the sidewalk buffer to deal with that issue. And we've seen it implemented in Boston, and they got 8 feet of snow 3 years ago, and they still plowed the separated bike lane. You had an 8-foot wall of snow next to it, which didn't comply with the sight distance requirements. But I mean, we've seen that it will work. You just need the equipment to be able to get in there and clear it out. Flexible delineators, sort of the go-to for any retrofit installation. The challenges with them is that it kind of looks like a traffic work zone, and so it might not be the appropriate locations. In some instances, you might want to consider something that's a little more large, that looks more substantive, like the ones Los Angeles and others have been doing, the K71 bollards. They certainly look more substantial, and we find that drivers kind of shy away from them a little bit more anecdotally. No studies on that I've seen. And then you can sort of mix and match as well. You can do flex posts and parking stops and other treatments based on the characteristics of your location. Another example of parking stops and flex posts. Planters are one that we hear lots of concerns from engineers about crashworthiness and what about clear zone, and these are fixed objects. And when you look at, and we summarize this in the FHWA Achieving Multimodal Networks Guide, when you're talking about low-speed environments, this idea of clear zone is really not relevant. It's not relevant to an urban environment or streets that are slower speed. So in AASHTO, we say above 30 miles an hour, or what is it, between 30 and 35, you need to be really deliberate in selecting a planter type that would break apart if it were hit at higher speed. On those lower speed roads though, like this example from Portland, you can have a concrete planter, and that's going to be okay from a low speed environment design consideration. And these are the types of things that some businesses are really going to like to see. It's more decorative, it doesn't look like a work zone, but these also require maintenance. So looking for opportunities to partner between different agencies is a good way to help to ensure that these are maintained. I encountered one in Connellsville, Pennsylvania along the east, no, the trail that runs between DC and
Great Allegheny Passage.
Great Allegheny Passage. And they had a sign there that said, "This buffer maintained by the local herb club." So, you know, they found partnerships to link agencies in a community, and I think that's what Keith was talking about this morning, is how do you find ways to engage with the public? This might be one of those opportunities to really link different agencies. On-street parking can serve as that buffer, with or without flex posts. Again, this is going to be contingent on how frequently that parking is occupied. So if it's not occupied all the time, you probably need to supplement it with flex post. If it's always occupied, the parking itself may be acceptable. But again, you have to think about the driver experience as well. Are they going to encroach in the bike lane if you don't put the flex posts? And that's going to vary based on their familiarity with the facility type. Are they the people that are parking there every day, or is this a business district that we need to be thinking about? Somebody that's new to the area doesn't really know where to park.
So we got 10 minutes left. We can let you all go now if you want, but we could do some Q&A, and we could also take a poll of like questions you have. So we have chapters on, we have a whole discussion on intersections that's covered in detail. We have a bike lane chapter, a rural road chapter, signals. We even have a high-speed intersection chapter, which is really interchanges, like highway interchanges, freeway ramps, things of that nature. So we tried to give the broadest range of conditions that are out there. And then we have, as Jeremy's mentioned, you know, we have a whole chapter that's on maintenance policies and practices. Because, and we acknowledge in the bikeway selection chapter that, frankly, there's going to be some agencies that make decisions on bikeway selection, not on what's the best thing for cyclists, but on what's the easiest thing for them to maintain. And so we talk about that as a legitimate choice, but we also talk about, well, understand the implications of that choice and who your design user is. And you may have just changed who your design user is so that it's easier for you to maintain it. And this is very typical of a DOT who owns the road, but they say it's a local responsibility to maintain the sidewalks. We'll build you bike lanes and shoulders because we can maintain it, but we can't maintain a separated bike lane because now there's a barrier. And I'm seeing that as a primary decision point in a lot of state DOTs of whether they're willing to build separated bike lanes. Like mentally, they're on board, they understand, but they just don't feel they have a process in place for maintenance. And so they're really looking for partnerships with local agencies to get them over the hump for that. So So maybe the best thing is just questions to kind of wrap up, and we can talk about anything.
My question's about separated bike lanes, either one-way or two-way, and if there's new thinking or new data or design recommendations about driveway plus side street frequency.
The frequency question comes up a lot, and we talk about it as a consideration, and it's going to come back to the site distance questions of how important that is, because at a certain site distance, you can do the math. You got to restrict parking 60 feet before an intersection, and I got a driveway every 100 feet. I don't have any parking left. We talk about a suburban environment where I have a driveway every 800 feet or more frequently, which is not uncommon in sort of these strip malling kind of places. Well, if you're going to do a retrofit and you're going to use flex post as your barrier, but it becomes a question of, is there a barrier anymore? Because if you've got so many driveways, you don't have place for protection, and there's no longer, what are you doing? You haven't really achieved protection. So we talk about it that way, but there's frankly no research that exists that is it dangerous. So one thing that's put out there a lot, and it's put out there going back really to Mr. Forrester, is that a side path's more dangerous than the road because of driveways or being off-road. So at a certain driveway frequency threshold, you're going to have more risk of crashes. Now that conceptually is true if there's a contraflow movement. So there's higher risk. Drivers are not looking for the other direction. But if the choice is a one-way movement, whether you're on the street in a bike lane or on the sidewalk, we're seeing a lot of research evidence that shows some of the historical research that said sidewalks are 6 times more dangerous than the road for cyclists are not accurate. They're not proving to be true when you really dug into the data, and actually the sidewalks were safer than the roadway environment in many cases for same direction traffic. That all the risk came from the contraflow movement. So that issue of driveway frequency, we're saying, is not a primary consideration when you're choosing a facility from a safety standpoint. It's really whether there's this retrofit situation.
And does that change if the corridor is one way for cars, both ways for the cycle track separated?
Yeah, so on a one-way street, we talk about, again, the research. That's great. We have research now. We find on one-way streets with protected facilities, you get contraflow riding. That it happens. That a certain percentage, whether it's 10, 20, 30% is going to happen, and you should be aware that that's likely to happen. And so we talk about, you need to understand the context of your network. Is there a good parallel system to support one-way operation on one-way streets? And if it's too out of direction, then you should anticipate wrong-way riding in your protected facilities. And maybe out of the gate, you should design it to be two-way so that it's safe for the people that are going to actually perform it, operate two-way in that facility. Because that's showing up in a lot of places that behavior is happening.
And some of that will be volume controlled as well. So once you're able to increase the volume of bicyclists, it sort of becomes self-enforcing. To go the wrong way doesn't work. But on opening day, sometimes that's the challenge.
Yeah.
So there's no set standard about if you have more than, every 200 feet or 100 feet or something crazy like that, you should not do a barrier-separated bike lane next to that?
Well, again, we're reluctant to kind of go that prescriptive because we want to make sure there's flexibility in the guide. But I think the reality is, if you can't provide protection because there's so many driveways, well, that decision's made for you. You're going to have to reconstruct the road and physically raise it up, like a raised bike lane. Some agencies are doing that. Or you're going to have a buffered bike lane. There's going to be no place for flex post.
And we wouldn't want to be prescriptive about it, because if you have a 10-block long corridor and one of the blocks has a situation like that, are you going to not do the project because of one location? We would much rather have agencies make those decisions based on the context.
But we do discuss them because we want to make people think about these issues.
Thanks.
Choose.
Suburban context around intersections, also thinking back to the statement about maintenance being a determinant for what they choose, DOTs. Probably not going to see a lot of protected intersections in the ones I'm thinking about, so what is sort of the threshold? What's the range of guidance guidance given around, like I'm thinking about
Let's
the
show-
lanes.
show them next there. So a mistake that's been made is we're really comfortable, and DOTs are really comfortable building side paths. We got 1 million miles. And they were poorly designed throughout the 70s and 80s, and a lot of them were curb attached with no buffer. But what we're really emphasizing is in side path, and we actually include side paths in the separated bike lane chapter, and we pulled it out of the shared use path chapter. So the shared use chapter is really about kind of through the woods. And side paths are really separated bike lanes, except pedestrians are allowed to walk on them. And all the safety value of protected intersection design needs to be applied to side path design. Offset intersections, race crossings, space separation, all these considerations. And then having a street buffer is super important in that decision to make it safe. So we're going to try to reframe side paths from being really the bad actor and really elevate the quality of the design of those and focusing at intersections where largely there was no thought put to it. And I think that was a tragic error that we can now correct and make a lot of side paths safer.
So does that mean there's no slip lanes at all?
Yeah, there should be, yeah, right. But we actually show in the high-speed chapter that, you know, in the slip lanes, you know, you got to be aware of the speeds, where's the crossing, what's the type of control. And then in a more urban environment, actually Colorado's been a leader in this. You know, why can't we have a race crosswalk in every slip lane if it's urban? There's really no excuse not to do that.
My question is just about the crosswalk on the right, and if you have guidance on markings for side paths and for shared use paths, but whether or not they should have like a zebra crosswalk, should they have green paint, how do you increase?
We're recommending that the crosswalks be high visibility generally. You know, just the 2 parallel lines is sufficient. You know, no driver can see them. And that if it's shared mixed use, then it's really just the standard white crossing. You know, they can be decorative, whatever the local agency wants, but we're going to show these standard ones. And then whenever there's separation of bicyclists, to mark it green so it's clear what it is. And there's a lot of discussion in the guide under the concept of legibility to mark the crossing for bikes. You know, whether it's a separated bike lane or a bike lane, and we should need to start thinking about making sure it's visible. And in any area of transition, we have a lot of discussion about transition because we're going to have a lot of transitions from shared use to protected bike lane to bike lane and buffered bike lane. That any transition area is a really important focus area. And then we really want to use green to really make it intuitive and obvious. And in Portland, I mean, last night we rode through a lot of those. The use of green was really powerful in making it obvious of where I'm supposed to go and how I'm supposed to navigate this transition, and that it can be a real helpful tool.
We'll take one more.
One thing I'm wondering about is, following up on the other question earlier about suburban locations. So, like in small towns and suburban areas, there's many reasons why the separated bike lane is less likely to work or less likely to be done because you have less cyclists, so you need maybe less. More driveways make it more challenging. You have to take more parking off the street, for example, if there's parking. And the maintenance issue, right? Small towns just don't have the maintenance budgets a lot of times to maintain a separate bike lane. They don't have a street sweeper for their streets a lot of times. Right? We don't have one on Kauai. We don't have a street sweeper at all, not even, much less a small one for a separate bike lane. So in those environments, I'm seeing, you know, painted buffered bike lanes and side paths, or like what's on the right, especially in the suburban environment, as something that's more, that can work better because of those reasons I just mentioned. Is that discussed, that kind of thing discussed much in the guide? I know there are other documents that talk about small town and rural environments.
Yeah, we talked about it. So it's in the bikeway selection chapter is where that decision gets made. And so we talked about in the context of if it's suburban and you're not expecting a lot of bike use and there's not a lot of ped use, then you're probably going to end up more in a side path design. But again, that's why the design chapter focuses on doing a higher quality design. We also talk about if you're having a situation where, well, because of driveways or maintenance or whatever decision, and I'm in an environment where I want a protected bike lane, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to do a buffered bike lane instead. You know, there's other things to think about. What's the speed limit? we actually talk about in this guide, the speed limit policy. And we say you shouldn't really necessarily rely on 85th percentile. We point to the US limits tool or federal highways put out to say it should be more context-based decisions in setting speed limits. Maybe it should be 50th percentile in here. That there's other things we could do to make that buffered bike lane more comfortable if that's the best you can do in some of these environments.
And recognizing that you're not going to accommodate every interested but concerned bicyclist when you deviate from that bikeway selection. So that's part of the trade-off as well, is recognizing you might not get the mode share that you were expecting because you've made a compromise on the facility selection itself.
And we emphasize options a lot more. And so we've got some details in the higher speed section, but in the bike lane chapter too, because we're going to keep building a lot of bike lanes. And we have a lot of bike lanes we're going to have to live with for a while. This idea of the exit ramp, a bike ramp, you know, I can be on a line of streets with my kids and I'm fine in a bike lane, but I can reach a pretty gnarly intersection. I want out. And to have an opportunity to get off out of the bike lane to the adjacent sidewalk would be a win. And that's not expensive, and that's something we can do a lot of. But the hang-up has been people with disabilities and blind people in particular, and the fear we're going to start having people walking into the street. And that's why the research that has been happening, the federal highway is super interested in the directional indicators, can help resolve that real issue of making sure we don't have people walking into the road, but actually give us some flexibility on the bike side to give people the opportunity to get out of the road. In the place where you want to get out of the road. It's not always at the intersection. Sometimes it's mid-block. And we can design in some ramps and make that safer for them. You know, an example would be an approach, you know, on a long suburban road and you got 40 miles an hour traffic and you're approaching an interstate on ramp. And now, you know, you got a 1,000-foot bike lane and you got traffic going 50 miles an hour on your left and traffic going 50 miles an hour on your right, and it's a death trap. And I want to get out of there, and there's no way for me to do it except to get off my bike and stand in the street and jump over the curb or the guardrail. That, you know, and we have a lot of drawings in there that show building in ramps to get out of that situation onto basically an exit ramp to the sidewalk to avoid those. So we're trying to recognize our built environment and give people some more options to think about how we make a better environment for people.
So that's unfortunately all the time we have, but we'll both be here the entirety of the conference. We know you have lots of questions, so come and pick our brains.
Well, before you go, there's one last thing. So, you know, we can't share the slides, but sort of the Beltway bandits that we are living in DC. So we're working with Federal Highway on a bike facility design course. And to their credit, it's going to be free. And it's going to be online. Because they've had a series of online bike and ped safety courses, but the problem is you have to sign up, attend a training, and there's 8 hours. These have been designed intentionally to be modular, 45 minutes. They include videos, they include lots of things. And we've included a lot of this content in those trainings. And so we're hoping, I believe, end of this year it'll be ready. And then that'll be something that you can go to, and then you can get your colleagues to sign up. Actually, we took the time to explain some of this more, and it's quite in-depth. We've got a lot of subjects covered, so look for that at the end of the year.